Okay, so thanks very much. Firstly, thanks for the invite. It's a pleasure to be able to speak to you today. But I'll start off, secondly, with an apology, because there's almost nothing I'm going to say today which is about East Anglia, I'm afraid, let alone Suffolk. But I do hope, despite that, that there's going to be some things, at least, which might be of interest to you. So I've been working on water beetles in one way or another, as was pointed out, for quite a long time. And what I want to do in today's talk is give you, firstly, a bit of an overview about water beetles, about water beetle diversity, the way in which they've colonized water over many times during the evolutionary history of beetles. I want to go on then to briefly consider water beetles as surrogates for wider freshwater diversity, and sort of make the point that as a group of organisms, they're very good at looking at issues to do with conservation and to do with habitat quality and habitat type across a wide spectrum of inland waters. I then want to talk briefly about relic species, some of the rarer species within the UK, and this is where I will mention things that are specific to East Anglia. But then I want to broaden out again and think about water beetles and what they can tell us about rarity in general, and whether they can give us any kind of indication as to whether rare or common species differ in their overall vulnerability to ongoing global changes. So if we think about water beetles in general, we reckon there's about 10,000 species of beetle which can be considered to rely on water in at least one part of their life cycle, if we think about this globally. And these are distributed across 3 of the 4 suborders of beetles in around 25 families. I say around 25 families because it really depends on which particular view of beetle classification that you actually hold. If we think about water beetle diversity, this is a summary diagram from Yeck and Balker's work in 2008, and we've got the dominant families of water beetles shown. The blue in the bars there, or the purple, depending on your perspective, is the bit which is telling us how many extant species there are, and the darker purple or reddish bits at the top are giving estimates of unknown species, undescribed species globally. And you'll see here that the dominant family, in terms of numbers of species across the globe, which is reflected as well in the British fauna, are the Dytiscids, the diving beetles. Second to those, and they may actually be even more diverse, we now suspect, than Yeck and Balker thought in 2008, are these things, the Hydrenids. These are some of the dots of the water beetle world. I found in South Africa a few years ago what's now a giant amongst the Hydrenids, in fact the largest Hydrenid on Earth, and it's all of 4.2 millimeters long. So most of these things are around about 1 millimeter to 2 millimeters in length, but they're highly diverse globally, although there's only a handful in Britain. Next, the hydrophilids. We've heard mention of the great silver beetle in an earlier talk. That's that genus are the biggest of the hydrophilids. Most of them are much smaller. We've also got, in terms of families with relatively high numbers of species, the elmids or the riffle beetles, and on there as well you've got things like the familiar Gyrinidae, the whirligigs. If we think about what water beetles do, if we think about them functionally, they've got really varied trophic ecologies. If we think about different groups of beetles, they feed in very different ways, often differently as larvae and adults as well. So we've got things like these Helophorus, which are largely feeding on biofilms, feeding on algae and bacteria. Some, although not very many, specialist herbivores, such as this Macroplea in the middle, which feeds on certain species of pondweed, and obviously predators like this familiar diving beetle. That one's one of the Hydaticus species. So if we think about different life cycles, different life histories and different trophic ecologies in different families of water beetles, I just want to contrast 2 examples. Here we've got things like the Dytiscids, which are predatory as both adults and larvae, and are aquatic as both adults and larvae. In other families, we have very different ways of life, very different approaches ecologically, such as these things, the skirtids or the marsh beetles. There's an aquatic larva of a skirtid and a terrestrial adult. In terms of the larvae, these are often important detritivores in many stream systems, some fens, and also in things like, in the case of this genus, in tree holes. So those holes you get in old beaches and things which fill up with dead leaves and are often quite anoxic. These things are really important members of the food web in these systems. And we can think of things like skirtids as almost being the flies of the beetle world, because they have relatively long-lived aquatic larvae and then relatively short-lived terrestrial adults. So the British member of this genus, Prionocyphon ceraticornis, for example, if you survey adults, you hardly ever find it. If you look at adult records, it could be considered a relatively rare species. But if you actually look in tree holes and get the larvae, you find that it's actually very widespread, and it's been shown in recent years to be much more common than people used to think, because the adult's so short-lived and difficult to get hold of. This is a summary of beetle interrelationships based on the Beetle Tree of Life project, using a variety of different genes to reconstruct the evolutionary interrelationships of different beetle groups. And it's showing things at the sort of major lineage level, at the suborder and superfamily level. And the reason for putting this on is just to point out that water beetles are scattered across the beetle phylogeny, across the Beetle Tree of Life. So if we look at these asterisks, I think there's about 11 on there, and it shows that water beetles have evolved in 3 out of the 4 different suborders of beetles and occur in at least 11 different superfamilies, different major groupings. So beetles have colonized water many times. You know, it's not just a case that we've got the diving beetles and then we've got the largely herbivorous polyphagon beetles that have colonized water twice. We've had multiple independent evolutions of water beetles across the radiation of beetles. And in some cases, we have evidence that there have been multiple habitat transitions within single beetle lineages. So if we pick on one of these, the one which shows it to the greatest extent, we think, the Hydrophiloidea, the group to which the great silver beetle and its allies belong, if we think about their evolutionary history, if you just concentrate on the right-hand side of the panel here, the Hydrophiloidea are most closely related to a group of beetles known as hysterids, which largely feed on things like mites and fly larvae, on carrion and dung. And we think that what's happened in the Hydrophiloidea is there's been an ancient transition to aquatic life. You know, the blue lines on here are showing aquatic lineages, the green ones are showing terrestrial lineages. Then we've had multiple re-invasions of terrestrial environments from aquatic beetles, and then in one group at least, this group, the Spherideinae, we've got evidence that they've gone back into the water again. So in some cases, we have a terrestrial ancestor giving rise to a radiation of aquatic beetles, then some of those aquatic lineages recolonizing land and back again. So multiple transitions, in some cases, within the same major lineage of beetles. As well as occurring in many families, being widespread phylogenetically and having varied trophic ecologies, we find that water beetles occur across what I'd say is the entire spectrum of inland waters. And this is one of the additional features which makes them useful if we're trying to look at habitat conditions and conservation assessments. So we get specialized water beetles in coastal rock pools, particularly in these supralittoral pools, which have virtually nothing else in terms of their fauna. These things are physiologically stressful, both for aquatic insects and for marine organisms. We find at the other end of the altitudinal spectrum that there are specialist water beetles living in alpine lakes, in spring systems, and occurring in snowmelts. And obviously, these kind of habitats have their own particular challenges for aquatic insects. Bogs and fens have a very wide variety of taxa found within them, particularly if we're thinking about relatively high latitude areas such as Northern Europe and North America. Here's one of the rarest species in the UK, a thing called Hydroporus ruffifrons, and one of the few sites in Britain where it's still extant in parts of West Wales. Go on. If we go further afield, very unusual specialized habitats also have specialist radiations of beetles in them. And I just wanted to highlight one in this slide, these hypersaline streams, which you find in many semi-arid parts of the world. These examples are in southeast Spain, in parts of Murcia province. So if you initially look at these kind of places, and it's particularly true if you go to them, you look at these small streams and you think, well, firstly, there's no macrophytes in them. Often there's some bacterial growth which looks a bit like sewage fungus, and there's no immediate obvious signs of any life in them. So it looks superficially like a degraded, polluted river course. But then if you start netting it, it's full of specialist insects, particularly water beetles. And in a European context, some of the most threatened species are actually specialists of some of these hypersaline streams. And ironically, the problem they have at the moment is the development of, I suppose it's analogous to what we have in Britain with agricultural runoff and agricultural pollution. But one of the problems these sites have is that they're getting fresher as a result of intensification of agriculture and a result of things like the development of golf courses, which brings more fresh water to the surface. And if you dilute the salinity of these sites, you get them colonized by more common generalist beetle species, which seem to be able to outcompete the specialists. Another specialised habitat I just want to very briefly mention, which is important in parts of the world outside northwest Europe, are wet rock faces. And the reason I mention these wet rock faces, such as this site in the mountains in the Western Cape of South Africa, is these have yielded some of the most sort of interesting discoveries in terms of new water beetles in the last 15 years. So the examples shown here, this little thing on the end of a pin and this drawing of this Aspidites species, these things are two families of beetles which were unknown before 2000. Both of these have been described in the last 15 years as entirely new families of Adiphaga, of predaceous water beetles, which seem to survive only in these wet rock sites in parts of, in the case of that one, South America, and this one in China and in South Africa. They seem to be in areas which have had relatively stable climates for relatively long periods of time. So water beetles are varied ecologically, multiple colonizations of an aquatic medium, and also occur across a broad spectrum of habitats. These three factors make them interesting from the point of view of aquatic conservation, I think, in that they can act as good surrogate taxa for what's going on in fresh waters and inland waters in general. Another feature about water beetles compared to many groups is they're relatively well studied and relatively well known. So if we think about the British Isles, for example, 2 out of 3 of the water beetle identification guides are already published. We should have the final one dealing with all the rest of the taxa out within the next 3 to 5 years, I suspect. And it means that there's a good taxonomic foundation for studying these. They're not as well known and as well studied as dragonflies, but there's enough of a basis to mean that you can go into working on water beetles and get something meaningful out of it. More globally, the taxonomic basis for study of water beetles is reasonably well founded. The first 3 volumes of these World Catalogues of Insects dealt with water beetles, and a 4th one on water beetles for the riffle beetles of the world will be out this year. So if you're working in different parts of the world, you've got at least a possibility of making up a checklist of your fauna so you know where to start in terms of the identification of the things you're actually finding. I think these kind of factors make water beetles very good surrogates for looking at, very good organisms to study for looking at wider freshwater biodiversity. And a number of studies by our group and by others have demonstrated the sort of value of water beetles in this way. So this is a study we conducted on a series of ponds on the Lizard down in southwest Cornwall and in the New Forest Basin, as people have alluded to already. This is a very important area of the country for fresh waters, and the Lizard in a southwest perspective is as well. Now these are ordination plots showing the interrelationships between sites in terms of the occurrence of different species in both the Lizard and the New Forest. At the top we've got for all different groups of freshwater macroinvertebrate that we identified. Then we've got there for, there we've got for the chironomids in the middle, we've got for the beetles next to them, we've got for the snails there, and we've got for the caddisflies. And although these plots look different, if you analyse this statistically, these plots all reflect each other very, very strongly. So in other words, the different groups are telling you more or less the same story. And if you look at the different taxonomic groups, the one that gives you the sort of best overview out of these taxa are really the beetles. So the beetles are telling us more or less what's going on in terms of the interrelationships between these sites without having to look at other groups. And what we find is that beetles are pretty good surrogates both for the number of species we find across the spectrum of macroinvertebrates, but also, as this study shows, to give us a perspective on the interrelationships between these sites. You know, how similar are their communities or assemblages at the different levels. Another thing this slide tells us is we don't really have to bother identifying chironomids, because we included chironomids here. You know, these are one of the taxonomically most intractable groups of freshwater organisms. Anyone who's tried to identify chironomid larvae, has anyone actually tried to do that? Fresh chironomid larvae, okay, so some have. It's a tall order, isn't it? Yeah, I think. Worse than beetles, yeah? Yeah, okay. Yeah, far worse. So basically we included the chironomids, and the chironomids don't really tell us anything different. You know, it's rare to include chironomids alongside all the other groups. This fact that they can serve as good surrogates means we can also use water beetles as a sort of model group to look at things like how well do protected area networks, which have been designated without thinking about aquatic fauna, how well do they conserve the aquatic biodiversity of a region? So this study I was involved with in the Iberian Peninsula in Spain and Portugal, we looked at different sort of protected area networks, which are the dark areas shown on these maps, so things that were protected at both national, international and local level, and how well do they capture the taxonomic diversity and the functional diversity of water beetles as a sort of key group of aquatic invertebrates. Now, another thing about beetles in many parts of Europe, but particularly so in Britain, is we know quite a lot about their distribution. This is the cover of the Atlas of Hydrodophaga, so the diving beetles and their allies. You should be able to get a copy of this within, I think, 2 to 3 months. Its final proofs have been gone through, and it is actually now in press. And here's the coverage map for Hydrodophaga. So you can see that there aren't that many gaps. We're not as good as the dragonfly people, okay? But these, for a relatively speciose, relatively diverse group of freshwater invertebrates, we've got pretty good coverage. It's one of the oldest recording schemes in the world, if we go back to Frank Balfour Brown's work earlier last century, and the efforts of my friend and colleague Garth Foster, who many of you probably know, in reinvigorating this recording scheme since the 70s, has generated a lot of interest and a lot of records. So a consequence of this is if we're thinking about what's rare and what's common in this group and what they actually mean, we've got a pretty good idea. And many of the taxa of water beetles which are particularly rare in the Britain and Ireland are what we call these relic species, which occur in natural or semi-natural wetland sites. So some of you may be familiar with this aerial photograph here at the top of Thompson Common. It's one of the best sites, possibly the best site for aquatic organisms in the UK. Very, very high diversity of species associated in Western Europe with relic fenland, with old wetlands. These wetlands formed in periglacial hollows towards the end of the last ice age, and we believe these sites have been wet since. And things like this, Hydropterus glabriusculus, this one Hydropterus scalesianus, this one Lecornis oblongus, relatively small water beetles are largely restricted to these kind of environments. This map shows you the distribution of Hydropterus scalesianus, the black symbols being obviously the extant sites, and the crosses, which I hope you can make out, are subfossil records, showing that in the past these things were much more common before we completely transformed our landscape. Interestingly, note the distribution of this thing in Ireland. This was first found in Ireland in the mid-1980s, but it turns out it's actually still quite widespread and common. A consequence of different land use histories in Britain and Ireland, particularly this sort of, I guess, the enclosure and agricultural intensification, associated urbanisation, which happened much, much earlier in Britain than elsewhere. I spent quite a lot of time, probably about 20-odd years ago now, studying this species, Hydropterus glabriusculus, and looking at populations in different parts of Britain and Ireland and comparing them with populations elsewhere in Northern Europe. And what we found was that if we looked at populations, sorry, the arrow should go to Sweden there. If we look at populations of these things in parts of Scandinavia where they're still relatively common, these things will fly in the lab. You heat them up under a lamp and they'll take flight. If you look at populations from Norfolk, populations in these Breckland sites, these things will never fly. So these isolated populations seem to have undergone selection against dispersal, against bothering to try and get around, possibly in relation to the fact that their habitat density is now so low, and they're effectively isolated in these relic sites. In this part of the world, these things never occur in newly created habitats. So one could ask the question as to whether increasing connectivity and increasing the sort of connectance of the remnant sites where these things occur would be a good thing. You know, some of these things occur in places like parts of the Norfolk Broads, parts of the Norfolk Breck. Should we increase habitat density? Should we increase connectivity? I think the key, if we're thinking about connectivity for species like this, which are effectively trapped in their little pockets in this landscape, is that we should think about water quality of this increased connectivity. I mean, Jeremy in the talk right at the start alluded to the fact that one of the key problems for a lot of organisms in fresh waters is this decline in water quality, particularly due to increased nutrient levels. And I'd point to studies like this of this Wilco Verburg and colleagues on Dutch bog systems, showing that increased connectivity and increasing water levels are not always a good thing for some of these rare specialist invertebrates. We've got to consider the quality of the water that we're increasing in the landscape, or the quality of the water that we're connecting these isolated sites with. Now I want to start for the end bit of my talk, to broaden out again a little bit from this sort of consideration of relic populations in the UK. Things like these species that I've talked about, these hydroporines, which are restricted to these old habitats in Britain and Ireland, if we look at them more globally, these things have relatively widespread distributions in the northern parts of Europe and Western Asia, the northern parts of the Palearctic. So these three species, for example, most of them extend almost to the Urals in parts of the former Soviet Union, and in some parts of their range, particularly in Eastern Europe and in Scandinavia and in parts of Western Russia, these things are relatively common. There's still a high density of habitats suitable for these species, and indeed in regions like that, such as in southern Sweden, you do find them in secondary sites. You find them in relatively newly created wetlands. So they're still getting around in the landscape, and they're still relatively common. And on a geographical scale, whilst they might be rare in the UK, over the globe as a whole, these things are relatively widespread. Because if we look at most beetles, like most organisms, it isn't the case. Most things are much less widespread. This map, the different colours of the different major species groups of a genus known as Deronectes. We have one of these in Britain, and you'll see that there's different species groups restricted to different parts of Europe and Western Asia, particularly around the Mediterranean. If we focus in on an individual species group, we find that there's a pattern emerging in that most of these species are actually pretty rare and pretty range restricted. The different symbols on the map here show us different species of one group of Deronectes, showing that they're restricted to different areas of the Iberian Peninsula. And indeed, in some cases, you get things that we could call almost point endemics, where they're found only in one particular place, one particular mountain system, sometimes one particular river system. An example in this genus is this thing, Deronectes algibensis. It's the Asterix just near Gibraltar there. Here's one of the streams in which it occurs in the Sierra Algebe in Malaga. So it's the norm to be quite restricted. And if we look outside beetles, as I'm sure you're aware, rare species are the norm. You know, we focus on rare species as conservationists, but if we think about most groups of organisms, we find the distribution of relative geographical range size is something like this, in that we have relatively high numbers of species with small ranges and very few that are extremely widespread. We get this kind of curve of relative distributional range size. And the question we've tried to address in recent years with using things like these Deronectes as a sort of model is, why is it fundamentally that most of these species are rare? What sort of controls differences in geographical range size, for example? And if we think about it, there's three possible drivers, there are, amongst others, three possible main drivers. Evolutionary age, relative dispersal ability, and how broad their niches are. And I just want to go through each of these in turn and sort of give you sort of an overview of how we go about addressing these. Because whilst there's a lot been written about differences in distribution and about rarity, there are very, very few empirical studies which have sort of compared these different drivers within individual groups of organisms. If we think about evolutionary age, I mean, all else being equal, we might expect older species to be more widespread than young species just because they've been around for longer and they've had more time to spread or more time to evolve to cope with different conditions. So we might expect, if we look at phylogeny like that geographical range extent might actually be positively related in some way to the length of those branches, which are reflecting how long ago these things shared a common ancestor. If we think about our Deronectes, we've got a reasonably good phylogeny, which we've reconstructed from both nuclear and mitochondrial genes, which we can use to sort of test for an effect of evolutionary age in these beetles. Another possibility, if we think about all else being equal, is that differences in geographical range size could be largely driven by differences in dispersal ability. So, you know, how good these things, in the case of things like these beetles that disperse largely by flight, how good they are at flying. And one way in which we can get at this in things like these Deronectes is look at wing size versus body size. And again, all else being equal, if these animals have relatively bigger wings, we might expect them to be better dispersers. And there's good evidence from damselflies and birds which shows that these kind of things do interrelate. In terms of niche breadth, in terms of the kind of habitats they occur in these Deronectes, we purposely pick things which, in terms of the macrohabitat and the microhabitat indeed, live basically in the same kind of place. So here's two rivers where we find a very range-restricted species in parts of northern Spain and a very widespread species which actually occurs everywhere from Greece to northern Scandinavia and also occurs in the British Isles. Here's 3 streams in southern Europe where we find different endemic species of these beetles. I mean, obviously, the main reason for doing this work was it got you to lots of nice places around the Mediterranean to sample beetles, okay? In terms of niche breed, these things, they're living in similar kind of habitats. The microhabitat you find them in the streams is more or less the same in these different species. And in terms of what they eat, they're generalist predators as larvae and adults. So what we looked at was whether their physiology differed, and particularly whether their temperature tolerance and their ability to acclimate to temperature differed. So we caught beetles, we kept them at 2 different temperatures, either 15 or 20 degrees. We kept them at those temperatures in tanks in the lab for a week, fed them chironomid larvae. And then we looked at the temperature at which they entered heat coma or chill coma. So we basically warmed them up slowly, cooled them down slowly, and looked at the point at which they no longer basically moved. They could no longer cope actively with that temperature. And this allows us to look at both the sort of absolute limits at upper and lower temperatures and also get a measure of acclimation. How much change is there if you're kept at a relatively warm compared to a relatively cold temperature? And we looked at how 2 aspects of geographical range were actually related to these physiological measures. One, the latitudinal range extent. So comparing things like this Deronectes angusii, it's actually the sister species of this thing, Latus, and look at the difference in geographical range extent in terms of the latitudes these things span. It's massively different. And also the position of the range. So if you look at where the range center would be in terms of latitude, for Latus it's up there in Central Europe, whereas for angusii it's obviously in northern Spain. Now, what we find when we do this, I don't want to consider the details of this table of multiple regression models, but basically thermal range and things to do with thermal biology are the best predictors of both relative range size and position in these beetles. Dispersal ability, relative evolutionary age don't seem to play much of a role. It's down to differences, we think, in terms of ecophysiology, and particularly down to differences in absolute thermal tolerance range. At the top there, we've got latitudinal range extent, LRE, and at the bottom there, we've got latitudinal range central point, the relative position of the range across a geographical span. And if we look at thermal range, the span between their lowest temperature tolerance and their largest temperature tolerance, widespread species are the ones that have the biggest range of temperature tolerances compared to their restricted relatives. So thermal range seems to be the best predictor of biogeography. And these beetles, at least, it doesn't seem to be to do with how long you've been around, how old you are in an evolutionary sense, or how good you are at getting about. It's mainly down to your ecophysiology that drives these differences. We see similar patterns in some other groups of diving beetles. This is a study on the Agabus brunnius group. Those of you who are familiar with brunnius will know that it's a really rare species in Britain, but globally it's the commonest member of this group. And we find that the 2 relatively widespread species, Didymus and brunnius, are much more tolerant of both low and high temperatures than the 2 restricted species, Rufulus and Rambli. Now, if we think about the rare species within a genus like this, the things that are range restricted and where they live, the places like this, the Sierra Nevada in southern Spain. And effectively, these are habitat islands for these organisms. They're occurring at intermediate elevations in streams which are fed by snowmelt, and they occur in almost island-like situations. We looked at how an organism's ability to acclimate, ability to sort of shift its temperature range, its temperature tolerance in response to exposure, varied with the absolute limits, both for upper and lower temperature tolerance in these Deronectes. And what we found is, whilst there's no pattern with lower thermal limits, in terms of upper thermal limits, the species which are hardest, if you like, which have the intrinsically highest ability to cope with high temperatures, they're also the ones which are more plastic in terms of those upper temperatures. So if you keep them at 15 and keep them at 20, they're the ones which show the biggest difference. Now, if you think of that plot, which shows this positive relationship between upper thermal limits and their sort of plasticity, you could substitute upper thermal limit on the bottom there, on the x-axis, you could substitute geographical range size. In other words, it's the rare species, these things which are rare and found in these mountain systems in southern Europe and restricted to these mountain systems, they're both bad at coping with heat intrinsically, and they have the least plasticity for that ability to cope with heat. So we'd argue that these things, in a global climate change perspective, are threatened on the basis of their physiology, and also threatened on the fact that habitat loss is going to result from the reductions in things like snowfalls, the reductions in the flow of relatively cold water, and the reductions in the number of permanent streams in these regions. So we think about places like the Sierra Nevada, these sort of alpine refugia right down near the southern coast of Spain. As climate warms, these beetles are intrinsically not that able to cope with these changes, but also their habitat's going to decline because of a reduction in the availability of the permanent streams on which they rely. So, am I nearly finished? I'm nearly done for time, I think, I assume, yeah? So, I hope over the course of the talk, you've got, if you didn't know anything about water beetles beforehand, you've got some handle on water beetle diversity and some of the reasons why they might be interesting, and some of the kind of things that they can tell us about aquatic conservation. So thanks very much for the invite again, and thanks for listening.